I found Karren Mitchells standing in my heated garage at 6 in the morning, her silver Lexus parked right where my truck should have been. And I knew my peaceful life in the Meadowbrook Hills community was about to get complicated. I had moved to this gated neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado 3 months ago after my divorce was finalized. The place seemed perfect at first. Beautiful mountain views, well-maintained streets, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. My name is Vincent Kowalski, and I had saved for years to afford this place. The heated garage was one of the main selling points for me. Colorado winters are brutal, and having a warm space to park and work on my vintage motorcycle meant everything to me. That morning, I had stepped into my garage through the interior door from my kitchen, expecting to grab some tools from my workbench. Instead, I found this blonde woman in her late 40s wearing a white tracksuit and enough jewelry to open a small boutique. She was using my garage as if it belonged to her, arranging what looked like storage boxes along the wall. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. "What are you doing in my garage?" She turned and looked at me with this expression of pure annoyance, like I was the one interrupting her morning. "Oh, you must be the new neighbor. I'm Karren Mitchells, HOA president. I'm just using this space temporarily. My garage is being renovated." I blinked at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. "This is my private property. You can't just use it without asking." Karren waved her hand dismissively, her numerous bracelets jangling. "The community rules allow HOA board members temporary access to community resources during emergencies or necessary situations. Besides, you have all this space, and you are barely using it. I saw through the window that you only have that old motorcycle." "That doesn't give you the right to trespass," I said, feeling my blood pressure rising. "I need you to move your car and remove your stuff. Now." She actually laughed at me. "Listen, Vincent, you are new here, so you don't understand how things work in Meadowbrook Hills. I've been the HOA president for 6 years. I know these rules inside and out. You should be grateful I chose your garage instead of someone else's. I'll only need it for a couple of weeks." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Karren said with a smug smile. "I have copies of the community bylaws in my car. You signed them when you bought your house. Section 12, subsection 4, clearly states that community board members have access to common areas and, in certain circumstances, private property for community purposes." I had read those bylaws when I purchased the house, and I was pretty sure that wasn't accurate, but Karren seemed so confident that I hesitated. "Even if that were true, which I doubt, you need to ask permission first. You can't just break into my garage." "I didn't break in. I used the external entrance code that your real estate agent provided to the HOA for emergency access." She turned back to her boxes, clearly considering the conversation over. I stood there for a moment, anger building in my chest. Then I walked back into my house, locked the interior garage door, and immediately started looking through my paperwork. I found my copy of the HOA bylaws and read through every single page. There was absolutely nothing that gave Karren or any board member the right to use my private garage. Section 12, subsection 4 that she mentioned was actually about maintaining common areas like the community pool and walking trails. I called a lawyer friend of mine, Daniel Morrison, who lived in Denver. After explaining the situation, he confirmed what I already suspected. "That's trespassing, Vince," Daniel said firmly. "The HOA president has no legal authority to use your private property without permission. You need to document everything and contact the police. Also, change that emergency access code immediately." I took his advice. First, I took photos and videos of Karren's car in my garage and all her storage boxes. Then I called the Boulder Police Department non-emergency line. They said they would send an officer out within a few hours. While I waited, I heard Karren's car start up in my garage. I rushed to the window and saw her backing out, apparently leaving for some appointment. But her boxes were still there, stacked against my wall. I took more photos to document that her belongings remained on my property. The police officer who arrived was a young woman named Officer Patricia Hayes. She listened to my story, reviewed my documentation, and checked the HOA bylaws I showed her. "This is pretty straightforward trespassing," Officer Hayes said, making notes on her tablet. "The HOA president has no authority to use your private garage without your explicit permission. I can file a report, but since she is not currently here, you will need to formally ask her to remove her property. If she refuses or returns without permission, call us immediately and we can arrest her for criminal trespass." "What about the emergency access code she used?" I asked. "Change it immediately. That code is meant for actual emergencies, like if you are incapacitated and emergency services need access. Using it for personal storage is an abuse of that system." Officer Hayes handed me a copy of the police report. "Keep this documentation. If she tries to retaliate through HOA actions, this will show a pattern of abuse of authority." After Officer Hayes left, I called a locksmith and had the garage code changed within 2 hours. Then I drafted a formal letter to Karren, citing the police report and demanding she remove her property by the end of the day. I sent it via certified mail and also emailed it to the general HOA email address, copying all board members listed on the community website. That evening, my doorbell rang aggressively. I opened it to find Karren standing there, her face red with fury. "How dare you call the police on me?" she shouted. "Do you have any idea what you have done? I have a reputation in this community. You trespassed on my property," I said calmly. "You need to remove your belongings from my garage immediately." "I will do no such thing. And furthermore, I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss your behavior. You are creating a hostile environment in this community. I have a police report that says otherwise. You have until midnight tonight to remove your stuff, or I'm filing charges for criminal trespass." Karren's eyes went wide. "You are making a huge mistake. I can make your life miserable here. Do you understand that? I can fine you. I can put liens on your property. I can make you wish you never moved to Meadowbrook Hills." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Are you threatening me?" She stepped back, suddenly aware that her outburst was being documented. "This isn't over," she hissed, then turned and stormed back to her house 3 doors down from mine. I forwarded the video to Officer Hayes and kept a copy for my records. Then I sat down and started researching Colorado HOA laws and resident rights. What I found was eye-opening. Colorado has some of the strongest HOA oversight laws in the country. HOA board members can be held personally liable for abusing their authority. There are strict rules about how HOA funds can be spent, how meetings must be conducted, and what rights homeowners have. I also discovered that all HOA board meeting minutes had to be available to residents upon request. The next morning, I submitted a formal request to the HOA for all board meeting minutes from the past year, all financial records, and copies of any complaints filed against residents. Under Colorado law, they had to provide these within 30 days. Karren's belongings remained in my garage. At 12:01 a.m., I called the police and reported that the trespasser had failed to remove her property. A different officer arrived, took my statement, and told me I could press charges if I wanted. I said yes. 2 days later, Karren received a summons to appear in court on criminal trespass charges. That same day, I received a notice from the HOA that I was being fined $500 for creating community discord and filing frivolous complaints against board members. That fine was a mistake on Karren's part. It gave me clear evidence of retaliation. I contacted Daniel again, and he agreed to represent me pro bono because he found the case interesting. We filed a lawsuit against both Karren personally and the HOA for abuse of authority, retaliation, and harassment. We also filed a complaint with the Colorado HOA Information Office, a state agency that investigates misconduct by homeowners associations. The HOA board meeting that Karren had threatened happened the following Tuesday. I showed up with Daniel, much to Karren's visible dismay. About 20 other residents attended, which was apparently unusual. Word had spread about what happened. Karren called the meeting to order, sitting at a table at the front of the community clubhouse with 3 other board members. There was Gerald Thompson, the vice president, a retired accountant in his 60s. Next to him sat Patricia Vanders, the secretary, a thin woman in her 50s who kept glancing nervously at Karren. The treasurer was Marcus Webb, a heavy-set man in his 40s who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. "We're here to discuss the complaint against Vincent Kowalski," Karren began, looking directly at me with barely concealed hostility. "Mr. Kowalski has demonstrated that he is unwilling to cooperate with community standards and has shown aggression toward board members." Daniel stood up. "I'm Daniel Morrison, Mr. Kowalski's attorney. Before we proceed, I need to inform everyone here that this meeting is being recorded, as is our legal right under Colorado open meeting laws. I also want to note that Ms. Mitchells is currently facing criminal charges for trespassing on my client's property, and the fine issued against Mr. Kowalski constitutes clear retaliation, which violates Colorado HOA regulations." The room went silent. Patricia Vanders looked shocked. "Criminal charges." "Karren, what is he talking about?" Karren's face flushed. "It's a misunderstanding. I was simply utilizing community resources. You broke into my garage and parked your car there without permission," I said clearly, so everyone could hear. "I have a police report and photographic evidence." Gerald Thompson cleared his throat. "Karren, is this true? Did you enter Mr. Kowalski's private garage without his permission?" "I had the emergency access code," Karren said defensively, "and the community bylaws allow for temporary use of spaces in certain circumstances." Daniel pulled out copies of the bylaws and walked to the front table. "I have the bylaws right here. There is no such provision. What Miss Mitchells did was criminal trespass, and using her position as HOA president to retaliate against Mr. Kowalski is a violation of Colorado Revised Statutes Title 38, Article 33.3, which governs HOA conduct." Marcus Webb, the treasurer, took the bylaws and started flipping through them. "I don't see anything about board members having access to private property." "That's because it doesn't exist," Daniel said. "Miss Mitchells fabricated that rule to justify her trespass." A woman in the audience raised her hand. She was younger than most of the residents, probably in her 30s. "I'm Jennifer Carlson and I live on Maple Drive. Karren used my driveway for 3 weeks last summer without asking. She said it was allowed under HOA rules. I didn't know I could say no." Another hand went up. An elderly man stood. "Robert Chen, Oakwood Court. Karren has been parking her second car in front of my house for months. Every time I ask her to move it, she says she's on official HOA business and has the right to park anywhere in the community." More residents started speaking up, sharing similar stories of Karren overstepping her authority. The meeting devolved into what was essentially a forum for complaints against the HOA president. Gerald Thompson looked increasingly distressed. "I wasn't aware of any of this. Karren, you never mentioned these situations in our board meetings." "Because they weren't important enough to bring to the full board," Karren snapped. "These people are making mountains out of molehills." "No," I said firmly. "We're talking about a pattern of abuse of authority. You've been using your position to benefit yourself at the expense of the community you're supposed to serve." Daniel added, "And under Colorado law, board members can be held personally liable for such actions. The fines, the damages, everything comes out of their personal assets, not the HOA's funds." Patricia Vanders looked alarmed. "We could be held liable for things Karren did. If you were aware of the misconduct and did nothing." "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "Marcus Webb closed the bylaws." "I move that we table the complaint against Mr. Kowalski pending a full investigation into these allegations." "Second," Patricia said immediately. "You can't do that," Karren protested. "As president, I have the authority to maintain order in this meeting. All in favor?" Gerald asked, ignoring Karren. 3 hands went up. Karren's was the only one that stayed down. "Motion carries," Gerald said. "Meeting adjourned." "Karren, I think we need to have a private conversation with you." As the meeting broke up, several residents came up to thank me for standing up to Karren. Jennifer Carlson gave me her contact information in case I needed another witness. Robert Chen did the same. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. The HOA's attorney advised the board that they needed to distance themselves from Karren's actions. A special meeting was called where the board voted to remove Karren as president, with Gerald Thompson taking over temporarily. Karren fought back by trying to rally her supporters in the community. She sent out a mass email claiming that I was a troublemaker trying to undermine community values. She stated that if residents didn't stand with her, the community would fall into chaos. It backfired spectacularly. More residents came forward with complaints about Karren's behavior during her tenure as president. Someone requested financial records and discovered that Karren had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal expenses, including gas for her car and meals she claimed were for board business, but were actually at expensive restaurants with her friends. Daniel helped me compile all this information for the district attorney's office. What started as a simple trespass case was now expanding into potential embezzlement charges. Meanwhile, Karren's criminal trespass case went to court. I testified about finding her in my garage, showed the photos and videos, and presented the police report. Karren's lawyer tried to argue that she had a good faith belief that the HOA bylaws allowed her actions, but the prosecutor pointed out that even a cursory reading of the bylaws would have shown that wasn't true. The judge found her guilty of criminal trespass and sentenced her to 30 days in jail, suspended, meaning she wouldn't serve time unless she violated probation. She also had to pay a fine of $1,000 in court costs. More importantly for my purposes, the judge granted me a restraining order requiring Karren to stay at least 100 yards away from my property. That restraining order became crucial because Karren violated it almost immediately. 3 days after the court hearing, I was working in my garage when I heard someone trying to enter the code on the external keypad. I checked my security camera, which I had installed after the first incident, and saw Karren standing outside, trying different number combinations. I called the police immediately. Officer Hayes responded again, and this time she arrested Karren on the spot for violating the restraining order. Karren spent that night in jail. The next morning, Her lawyer managed to get her released on bail, but the violation of the restraining order meant her suspended sentence was now activated. She had to serve the original 30 days, minus time served. While Karren was in jail, the HOA board's investigation into the financial irregularities continued. Marcus Webb, the treasurer, discovered that over the past 2 years, Karren had spent nearly $40,000 in HOA funds on personal expenses. She had disguised them as community expenses, but the receipts told a different story. The board filed a police report for embezzlement. The district attorney's office began a formal investigation. I also pursued my civil lawsuit. With Karren facing criminal charges, her homeowner's insurance refused to cover her legal defense, arguing that intentional criminal acts weren't covered under the policy. Karren had to hire a criminal defense attorney with her own money. During the discovery phase of my lawsuit, we uncovered even more problems. Karren had been systematically targeting residents she didn't like with frivolous fines and violations. She had kept some of the fine money for herself instead of depositing it into the HOA account. She had even used her position to pressure a contractor into giving her a discount on her home renovation by threatening to blacklist him from working in the community. That contractor, a man named Steve Patterson, was more than happy to testify once he learned he wouldn't face retaliation. His testimony was damning. He detailed how Karren had explicitly told him that if he didn't give her a 50% discount on her kitchen remodel, she would make sure no one in Meadowbrook Hills ever hired him again. The HOA board, now thoroughly embarrassed by the situation, agreed to settle my lawsuit for $75,000 and a formal apology. They also agreed to implement new oversight procedures to prevent any future board member from abusing their authority. But I wasn't done. I wanted to make sure Karren faced consequences beyond just the criminal charges. Colorado law allows homeowners associations to evict owners who engage in criminal activity that threatens the safety or welfare of other residents. With Karren's multiple convictions for trespass, violating a restraining order, and the pending embezzlement charges, I petitioned the HOA board to begin eviction proceedings. Gerald Thompson was initially reluctant. "I understand your anger, Vincent, but eviction is extreme. Where will she go?" "She should have thought of that before she committed multiple crimes," I said. "She used her position of trust to abuse residents, steal money, and trespass on private property. If we don't take strong action, what message does that send?" Other residents agreed with me. At the next community meeting, more than 60 homeowners showed up, the largest turnout in the community's history. One by one, they stood and shared their experiences with Karren's abuse of power. There was Margaret Foster, an elderly widow who had been fined repeatedly for minor violations like having the wrong shade of paint on her shutters. Karren had used these fines to pressure Margaret into voting for her proposals at community meetings. There was David and Linda Porter, a young couple who had been denied permission to install solar panels on their roof. Karren had blocked their request personally, not because it violated any community rules, but because she thought solar panels looked ugly. After they complained, Karren had cited them for 14 separate violations in a single month, including things like their mailbox being 2 inches too tall and their grass being a 1/4 inch too long. There was Thomas Wright, a middle-aged man who ran a small consulting business from his home. Karren had threatened to fine him for running a business in a residential area, even though his work was completely online and generated no traffic or disturbance. When he refused to pay her off, she had filed a formal complaint that cost him thousands in legal fees to fight. The stories went on and on. By the end of the meeting, It was clear that Karren had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, rewarding friends and punishing anyone who crossed her. The board voted unanimously to begin eviction proceedings based on the criminal convictions and the pattern of behavior that created a hostile environment in the community. Karren's lawyer fought the eviction, arguing that it was retaliatory and that Karren had already been punished enough through the criminal justice system. But Colorado law was clear. An HOA could evict an owner who posed a threat to the community's welfare, and Karren's pattern of abuse and criminal behavior clearly met that threshold. The eviction hearing was held in Boulder County Court. Daniel represented me and several other residents who supported the eviction. Karren represented herself because she could no longer afford an attorney after paying for her criminal defense. She tried to portray herself as a victim of a witch hunt, claiming that I had orchestrated a campaign against her because I didn't want to follow community rules. But the judge reviewed the evidence, the criminal convictions, the embezzlement charges, the testimonies from dozens of residents, and the financial records showing misuse of HOA funds. The judge ruled in favor of the eviction. Karren had 90 days to sell her home and leave the community. If she failed to do so, the HOA could foreclose on her property to recover the money she had stolen. Karren made one last desperate attempt to rally support. She hired a public relations firm to portray her story as an example of HOA overreach and resident bullying. A local news station even did a story on her, presenting her as a dedicated volunteer who had been pushed out by an unruly mob. That backfired too. The reporter who did the initial story was contacted by Daniel with all the evidence of Karren's crimes and misconduct. The news station did a follow-up story that exposed the truth, including interviews with residents Karren had victimized. The public relations disaster was the final straw. Karren listed her house for sale at a significantly reduced price, desperate to get out before the 90 days expired. She sold it in 45 days, taking a substantial loss because of the rushed sale and the stigma attached to the property. During this time, Karren's embezzlement trial proceeded. The evidence was overwhelming. Receipts, bank records, testimony from contractors and vendors, and the HOA's own financial documents all pointed to a clear pattern of theft. Karren tried to claim that she had simply been careless with record keeping and had always intended to reimburse the HOA. But the prosecutor demonstrated that she had actively concealed her spending, falsified records, and continued taking money even after she knew she was being investigated. The jury convicted her on 17 counts of theft and embezzlement. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, which with interest and penalties totaled nearly $60,000. Karren's house sold just before she had to report to prison. She used most of the proceeds to pay the restitution and her legal fees, leaving her with almost nothing. I watched from my driveway the day she moved out. She loaded her belongings into a moving truck, her face hard and bitter. She glanced at my house once, and I could see the hatred in her eyes. But she didn't say anything. She got into her car and drove away, and that was the last time I saw Karren Mitchells. The community underwent significant changes after Karren's removal. Gerald Thompson served as president for the remainder of Karren's term and then chose not to run for re-election. A new board was elected, including Jennifer Carlson, who ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. One of the new board's first actions was to establish term limits for board members and create an oversight committee to review all board expenditures over $500. They also implemented a formal complaint process with neutral arbitration for disputes between residents and the board. The contractor Karren had pressured, Steve Patterson, was formally apologized to and invited back to work in the community. He ended up getting several contracts, including one to renovate the community clubhouse. Margaret Foster, the elderly widow who had been harassed with frivolous fines, had all her past fines refunded. The community even organized a fundraiser to help her with some needed repairs to her home that she hadn't been able to afford because of the money Karren had extracted from her. As for me, life returned to normal. I could park in my heated garage without worrying about finding someone else's car there. I worked on my vintage motorcycle in peace. The community actually became the quiet, pleasant place I had hoped it would be when I first moved in. I did stay involved in HOA affairs, though. I attended meetings regularly and volunteered for the oversight committee. My experience with Karren had taught me that HOAs can be beneficial when run properly, but they require active participation from residents to prevent abuse. About 18 months after Karren went to prison, I received a letter from her. It had been forwarded through the district attorney's office. In it, Karren apologized for her actions. She wrote that prison had given her time to reflect on how she had abused her position and hurt people. She admitted that she had let the power go to her head and had convinced herself that she was entitled to special treatment because of all the work she did for the community. The apology seemed genuine, but I didn't respond. Some wounds don't heal just because someone says sorry. The damage Karren had done to the community and to individual residents was real and lasting. Margaret Foster still flinched when she received mail from the HOA, even though the new board was nothing like the old one. David and Linda Porter eventually moved away because they could never feel comfortable in the community again. I did follow up on what happened to Karren after her release from prison. She served 3 years before being paroled for good behavior. She moved to Arizona to live with her sister and, according to a mutual acquaintance, now works as a receptionist at a medical clinic. She is banned from serving on any HOA board as part of her parole conditions, which will remain in effect for 5 years after her release. The community of Meadowbrook Hills thrived after the scandal. Property values actually increased because the story of Karren's removal and the reforms that followed attracted buyers who wanted to live somewhere with strong accountability measures. The new board published an annual report detailing all expenditures and activities, something Karren had never done. I ended up making some good friends in the community. Jennifer Carlson and I became close, bonding over our shared experience of dealing with Karren's abuse. Robert Chen taught me how to make traditional Chinese dumplings, and we had regular dinners together. Thomas Wright and I started a small business consulting group that met monthly at the community clubhouse. The heated garage that had started this whole mess became a gathering place for neighborhood kids interested in learning about mechanics. I started an informal Saturday morning workshop where I taught teenagers basic car and motorcycle maintenance. It turned out to be incredibly rewarding, and several of the kids went on to study engineering or automotive technology in college. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned several important lessons. First, standing up to bullies is necessary, even when it's difficult and stressful. If I had just let Karren use my garage, she would have continued abusing her power and hurting other residents. Second, documentation is crucial. The photos, videos, police reports, and written communications I maintained throughout the conflict were essential to proving my case both criminally and civilly. Without that evidence, it would have been my word against hers, and as the HOA president, she had institutional credibility I didn't have as a new resident. Third, community matters. The reason Karren was ultimately held accountable wasn't just because I stood up to her, but because other residents found the courage to come forward with their own stories. Abuse of power thrives in silence and isolation. When people share their experiences and support each other, bad actors lose their ability to divide and conquer. Fourth, systems need checks and balances. The old HOA structure gave the president too much unchecked authority. The reforms implemented after Karren's removal created multiple layers of oversight that made it much harder for any one person to abuse their position. Finally, I learned that home isn't just about the physical structure you live in. It's about the community around you and the relationships you build. Meadowbrook Hills became my true home not because of my house with its heated garage, but because of the people I met and the shared experience of working together to create a better neighborhood. The vintage motorcycle I had been restoring when Karren first trespassed in my garage was finally completed 2 years after I moved in. It was a 1972 Honda CB 750, cherry red with chrome accents. I took it for its first real ride on a crisp October morning, cruising through the mountain roads outside Boulder, with the autumn leaves creating a golden canopy overhead. As I rode, I thought about how different my life might have been if I had just accepted Karren's trespass, if I had been intimidated by her threats and position. I would have kept my head down, avoided conflict, and lived quietly. But I also would have lived under the shadow of someone else's bullying, and other residents would have continued to suffer. Instead, I had fought back. It hadn't been easy. There were sleepless nights worrying about legal bills, stressful court appearances, and moments when I wondered if it was all worth it. But in the end, justice prevailed. Not just for me, but for everyone Karren had victimized. The community even erected a small plaque in the clubhouse commemorating the reforms implemented after the scandal. It reads, "Good governance requires transparency, accountability, and the courage to speak truth to power." May we always remember that those who serve do so at the pleasure of those they serve, not the other way around. I smile every time I see it. 3 years after the whole ordeal began, I was elected to the HOA board myself. I never imagined I would want to be involved at that level, but after everything that happened, I felt a responsibility to help ensure that the reforms we had implemented remained in place. My first board meeting as a member was surreal. I sat at the same table where Karren had once held court, but the atmosphere was completely different. We discussed community issues openly, sought input from residents, and made decisions based on what was best for everyone, not what benefited us personally. Gerald Thompson, who had since retired from the board, attended that meeting. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "You know, Vincent, when you first moved here and all this started, I thought you were going to be trouble," he admitted. "I thought Karren was just being Karren, maybe a bit pushy but meaning well. I was wrong. You did this community a tremendous service by refusing to back down." "I couldn't have done it alone," I replied. "It took everyone working together." "True," Gerald agreed. "But someone had to be willing to take that first step, knowing they would face the most resistance. That was you. Don't minimize what you did." His words stuck with me. It's easy to underestimate the importance of individual action, to think that one person can't make a difference against an entrenched system. But Karren's downfall proved otherwise. One person standing up, documenting abuse, and demanding accountability can spark a movement that transforms an entire community. The legal aftermath continued for years. Karren's restitution payments came in small amounts, garnished from her wages in Arizona. The HOA received a check for $137.50 every month, slowly chipping away at the $60,000 she owed. At that rate, it would take decades to repay fully, but the new board decided that pursuing more aggressive collection wasn't worth the cost and stress. Some residents wanted to forgive the debt entirely, arguing that Karren had already been punished enough. Others, particularly those who had been her primary victims, insisted that she needed to be held fully accountable. The board eventually compromised, agreeing to forgive the debt after 10 years if Karren maintained consistent payments and stayed out of trouble. My civil settlement from the HOA came through without complications. I used part of the money to upgrade my garage with better security systems, better lighting, and some new tools. I donated a significant portion to a local nonprofit that helped homeowners fight HOA abuse. The rest went into savings. Jennifer Carlson, who had become HOA president in the election following Gerald's retirement, sometimes asked my advice on handling difficult situations. The new board faced challenges of their own, though nothing approaching the corruption of Karren's tenure. There was the dispute over the community pool renovation, with residents split over whether to add a hot tub or expand the children's area. There was the controversy over allowing backyard chickens, which some residents wanted for fresh eggs and others thought would attract predators and create noise. There was the ongoing maintenance of common areas as the community aged and infrastructure needed updates. But these were normal challenges, resolved through open discussion, resident input, and voting. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was evicted. Nobody abused their power for personal gain. That, in the end, was the real victory. Not just stopping Karren, but creating a functional system that served the community rather than exploiting it. The garage that started everything became a symbol of sorts in the neighborhood. When new residents moved in, someone would inevitably tell them the story of the HOA president who tried to steal someone's garage and ended up in prison. The tale grew slightly more exaggerated with each retelling, but the core truth remained. I sometimes wondered what Karren was doing in Arizona, whether she had truly changed or just learned to hide her behavior better. I wondered if she ever thought about Meadowbrook Hills and the life she had destroyed through her own arrogance and greed. Mostly, though, I stopped thinking about her at all. She had occupied enough of my mental space during the conflict. I refused to give her any more. Instead, I focused on building the life I had moved to Colorado for in the first place. I dated occasionally, though nothing serious developed. I took up rock climbing and discovered a love for the sport. I continued working on vintage motorcycles, eventually buying a second bike that needed restoration. The community became my extended family in a way I hadn't expected. When I caught the flu one winter, Jennifer brought me soup and checked on me daily. When Robert Chen's wife passed away, the entire neighborhood rallied around him, organizing meals, helping with arrangements, and providing companionship during his grief. These were the moments that defined what Meadowbrook Hills had become. Not the conflict with Karren, but what emerged afterward. A real community where people looked out for each other, where leadership served rather than ruled, where disputes were resolved fairly rather than through intimidation. 5 years after Karren went to prison, I received another letter from her. This one was different from the first. She had completed her parole successfully and wanted to express her gratitude that the community had agreed to the eventual debt forgiveness plan. She had been attending therapy and working through her issues with control and entitlement. She also mentioned that she had been following news about Meadowbrook Hills online and was glad to see it thriving. She wrote that she had no desire to return, that she had found peace in her new life. But she wanted me to know that the accountability I had forced on her had ultimately saved her from a path that would have destroyed her completely. This time, I did right back. I kept it brief, but acknowledged her apology and wished her well. There was no point in holding on to anger. She had faced consequences, made restitution, and apparently learned from her mistakes. That was all anyone could reasonably ask. The Meadowbrook Hills community continued to evolve. New families moved in, attracted by the area's reputation for good governance and community spirit. The reforms implemented after Karren's removal became a model that other Colorado HOAs studied and sometimes adopted. I even gave a few presentations at HOA conferences, sharing the story and the lessons learned. The audience reactions were always interesting. Some board members seemed defensive, as if I was attacking all HOAs. Others nodded knowingly, having experienced similar issues in their own communities. A few approached me afterward to share their own horror stories about board corruption. The most rewarding responses came from ordinary homeowners who attended these conferences to learn how to fight back against abusive boards. They thanked me for showing that it was possible, that standing up to bullies could lead to real change. One woman, tearful, told me about her HOA president, who had been systematically targeting her with fines because she had complained about his misuse of funds. She had been afraid to fight back, worried about legal costs and social isolation. After hearing my story, she decided to document everything and file complaints with the appropriate authorities. A year later, she sent me an email. Her HOA president had been removed, financial reforms implemented, and the community was healing. She thanked me for giving her the courage to act. That email meant more to me than any legal victory or financial settlement, because it proved that the impact of standing up to Karren extended far beyond Meadowbrook Hills. It gave others hope and a roadmap for holding their own abusive boards accountable. I framed that email and hung it in my garage, right next to my workbench. Whenever I worked on a motorcycle or organized a weekend workshop for neighborhood kids, I saw it and remembered why all the stress and conflict had been worthwhile. The heated garage was just a garage in the end. But what it represented, that willingness to defend your rights and hold the powerful accountable, that was something worth fighting for. Years passed. The story of Karren Mitchells faded from daily conversation in Meadowbrook Hills, becoming part of community lore rather than current events. New residents knew the broad strokes, but not the details. The reforms remained in place, now so normalized that people couldn't imagine the HOA operating any other way. I eventually did meet someone special, a woman named Olivia Carter who moved into the community several years after the scandal. She was a freelance graphic designer with a quick wit and infectious laugh. We bonded over our shared love of outdoor activities and old movies. I told her the Karren story on our third date, wanting to be upfront about the dramatic history. I worried it might scare her off, this tale of conflict and legal battles. Instead, Olivia laughed and said, "So you're telling me you're the guy who took down the evil HOA president? That's the most attractive thing anyone has ever told me on a date." We were married 2 years later in a ceremony at the Meadowbrook Hills clubhouse, surrounded by the community that had become our home. Gerald Thompson officiated. Jennifer Carlson was in the wedding party. Robert Chen catered the reception with his famous dumplings. Standing in that clubhouse, looking at all the people who had become family, I realized how much my life had changed since that morning I found Karren in my garage. What could have been just an unpleasant confrontation with a neighbor had transformed into a journey that reshaped a community and taught me profound lessons about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. The garage where it all started still stands, of course. My vintage motorcycles still sit there, now joined by Olivia's mountain bike and our camping gear. The heating system still works perfectly, keeping everything warm during harsh Colorado winters, but I never take it for granted. Every time I press the button to open that garage door, I remember that private property rights matter, that abuses of power must be challenged, and that ordinary people can make extraordinary changes when they refuse to accept injustice. Karren Mitchells tried to use my heated garage without permission and ended up losing everything. That's the simple version of the story. The deeper truth is that she lost everything because she had built her life on a foundation of entitlement and abuse, and eventually, that foundation crumbled. Meanwhile, I gained something far more valuable than a heated garage or a legal settlement. I gained a real home in a real community, built on principles of fairness, transparency, and mutual respect, and that made every difficult moment of the fight worthwhile.